Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session that is arranged by the Swedish Standards Institute, SIS. First of all, I would like to thank ICTSD, SECO, and our experts for making this session possible. Our session will be, as Adriana said, about international standards and how the use and influence of standards can support and promote international trade, opportunities, and sustainable development. I and my colleague Frederick represent the department within the SIS that works with international development cooperation. We see international standards as a way to support international trade, national growth, and a sustainable development. We cooperate with developing countries in order to support the national standardization bodies and to get a stakeholder-driven standardization process. We also work with capacity building in the developing countries, as well as to get to support them to have an active role and to participate in the standardization process. And then once the standard is more agreed upon, we also support the improved knowledge of the standard implementation. The main reason why we do this is in order to get more global relevant international standards. According to ISO, the definition of global relevance is the required characteristics of an international standard that can be used, implemented as broadly as possible by affected industries and other stakeholders in markets around the world. We are currently cooperating in 3 main regions in the world. It's the East African community, the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, and the South and Southeast Asia. And the main goal with these projects that we are managing in these regions are to reduce poverty by getting more global relevant international standards that can support the trade opportunities and a sustainable development. And then for this session that we have here today, we first have Mr. Stefan Denzler that will be introducing and make a short presentation of SECO. Secondly, we have Mr. Paul Valakira that will present a local East African initiative related to greenhouse gas management and carbon footprint standardization. Third, we have Barbara Niebel that will demonstrate the life cycle analysis as a central method quantifying greenhouse gas and carbon footprints. She will also give practical examples and case studies on different products. Then we're also very happy to have Mr. Dale Andrew from OECD that will be discussions for these presentations. And then finally, we hope to have some time left for questions and discussions. Okay, I give the word to you, Mr. Denzler.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to present you in a couple of minutes the activities of the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs on our development cooperation and in particular activities that are in link with CO2 footprint. SECO, the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Development Cooperation, is probably what in other countries would be the trade ministry of a country. So we have a lot to do in general with trade. We do all the free trade agreements of Switzerland, for instance, but we have one branch that is operating with economic development cooperation. So we do also manage ODA of Switzerland. These activities are focused, in fact, on investment promotion, trade promotion, infrastructure financing, and macroeconomic support. As you can see, it's focused on a very limited number of countries, mainly middle-income countries, where these instruments are most efficient. And the interesting thing, it's rather coincidence that these are also countries that have a high potential for CO2 reduction. In the area of climate change mitigation, we have basically 3 strategic axes where we are active. Let me check whether the pointer is working. Yeah. This is energy efficiency, renewable energies, and the sustainable use of natural resources. In these areas, we do different approaches: know-how transfer, capacity building, technology transfer, investment, institutional setup for partner countries. A couple of words to fast start financing in these areas, since this is always an area where we are criticized that there would be no flow of money and funds. In February this year, Swiss Parliament has approved additional 125 million for bilateral fast start financing. In fact, it's managed 50% by our institution and 50% by SDC, that's the Swiss Agency of Development Cooperation in the Foreign Ministry. Examples of projects that we have approved in the months since February is, for instance, resource efficient and cleaner production with UNIDO. That's a project aiming at reducing resource consumption in the industry sector of many partner countries. It's working with about 15 countries. This is an interesting approach, since the general resource consumption also contains a lot of CO2. So if you can reduce the inputs in metal and chemical substances and so on, you reduce CO2. It is also covering in particular energy issues. For instance, one module of this program we are financing is aiming directly at the potential of energy production out of organic waste in the industry, in the agro-industry. Second program we are supporting on the fast start financing is Carbon Fund of FCPF. I think you know this more than me. This has to do with RED+. Then a third one, Partnership for Market Readiness, that is creating and using new market instruments for emerging markets. Then a very interesting one from probably this point of view of the CO2 standards is Top 10 China. That's a project on energy efficiency for consumer goods in China, and it's creating independent market information on the products that are available in the Chinese market. So it's dealing about refrigerators, TV screens, air conditioners, cars, and so on. And then also we are active in the construction sector with the Green Building Code, for instance, with Colombia. Maybe one example of a project that finally was supported through the Resource Efficient and Cleaner Production Program and could be interesting here is the issue of asparagus exports from Peru. There is a lot of criticism that this would be not environmentally sound, the CO2 footprint is too high, so we should not consume this product in Switzerland. And there was an interesting solution. We worked then together with the producers in Peru and analyzed the situation, tried to bring down the reduction on the spot as far as possible, and also cooperated with them how to use the certificates, the CO2 certificates, in order to completely carbon neutralize the product. So they finally could offer to the Swiss importer a CO2 neutral product. Then we do also CDM capacity building. That's maybe also an interesting information for you. We have supported the World Bank, Carbon Finance Assist in building up the DNAs of many countries in developing CDM methodologies. And the project I just mentioned before, that's an interesting approach. We see that this is a topic for many emerging markets. We have similar requests from South Africa, even from Peru, from Colombia, to work on the one hand on the voluntary field of market information on consumer goods, on CO2 footprints of these goods, and on the other hand in the compulsory sense to establish energy labeling systems. So that's something which is compatible, or it's two sides of the same thing, because you need the same type of underlying information for both approaches. You need an independent testing system that would give you the reliable information of the real energy consumption of these products. And you cannot usually rely on the producer's information, so you have to do third-party testing. The second field of natural resources, that's maybe not so close to the topic of CO2 carbon footprint for you, but it's interesting. It has to do a lot also with standards in a more broader view. For instance, the Biotrade Facilitation Program, that's a program of export promotion out of local biodiversity potential. So it's products where you do manage the natural ecosystem in a sustainable way, and at the same time you extract a producible product. And this has to do, of course, with protection then of the original forests, and so it has a CO2 impact. Then Switzerland is a very important trade platform internationally. Large proportions, for instance, of international cotton trade are managed by companies in Switzerland. And we are very active in trying to introduce sustainability standards in this international trade. So in the cotton field, for instance, that's the Better Cotton Initiative. And these standards do include also the CO2 issue. Access benefit sharing, another topic we have to do. Then we are also active in establishing organic production schemes in partner countries. We have done in a couple of countries the creation or establishment of the national certification body for organic production. For instance, IndoCert, that's the Indian certification body. And there are, of course, two impacts on the CO2 side. One is the fertilizer issue. If you have traditional production, you have a lot of chemical fertilizers which have a high CO2 content. If you switch to organic production, you can eliminate these. And the second one is the CO2 capturing potential of the soil if you do organic production. Then the sector of infrastructure financing that I have mentioned at the beginning. Here a picture of a hydropower plant in Albania, in southeastern Europe, that we have modernized together with other donors. You may say that had not much to do with the CO2 ISO standard on CO2 footprint, but it has in fact. On one side, it's the issue of green power, green electricity. I don't know whether people from developing countries are familiar with this concept, but in our countries, in Switzerland, for instance, as a consumer, you can buy what is called green electricity. So as a consumer, you pay an additional price, and the deal is that your power utility will invest this additional incremental price into new renewable power facilities. So in fact, it's a different type of electricity that artificially is created in the market. Physically, you have the same power mix that is coming out of the grid in the first moment, but commercially, you give a high incentive for this power utility to invest in new schemes. And in fact, it would be interesting to think how this could work also between developed and developing countries, because there is no reason why this should not be invested also in developing countries. There is, for instance, no limitation that it has to be invested in the same region. The power utility can this do anywhere. The second link to the CO2 footprint, of course, if in the case of Albania, if we manage to run this hydropower plant more efficient, and in that case it was an improvement of 10%, so it's 10% more efficient now, and it produces 10% more power. You have an influence on the national power mix, and then this would directly come out if you do the CO2 calculations. Other topics we are also invested is, for instance, the World Bank scaling up renewable energy program. I think there will be some side events here. The first project is on geothermal energy with Kenya. So that's also interesting. We have done a biofuels study together with EMPA. That was a very interesting exercise because we wanted to know which type of biofuels are CO2 friendly and which one not, and where in the value chain exactly comes the CO2 factor in. And it was interesting to see that the result showed that it was not a problem of the let's say, similar as in the food industry, you have this food mile concept, so it's not the issue of the distance. meaning if we are buying biofuels from South America, for instance, the main issue is not the transport to Switzerland. The basic issue is the production side, so how the production is organized, and then also in our country the fine distribution issues. So the distance is not a relevant factor in these schemes. And we are doing similar studies on country level now. I think there is one going on, or maybe even concluded for Colombia, another one in Peru, which would really then look at the specific sites. We have done an online instrument, CO2 footprint quick check tool, where a producer can fill in his data and sees whether his production scheme is CO2 friendly or not. Then I think I will not talk too much on this. It's about cities also and climate change, just to say that cities are also an important issue. There are lots of side events here, there are a lot of mayors even here. And the link to this topic today will probably be there is also an issue of GHG accounting on the city level. So you can do CO2 inventories for one city. And then a last cross-link to our cooperation, and also in this context I would like to mention specifically our Swedish colleagues, of course, and thank to them for this cooperation. We are really like-minded also in this topic. We have an interest that the database is improved for all the issue of CO2 footprinting. If companies calculate whether one project is CO2 friendly or not, they have to use the available data, and this comes out of international databases. The most important one is called EcoInvent, and it's based mainly on information from the European and US markets. And we do, under our development cooperation, try to include more data from Asia, Latin America, Africa, so as to supply the interested consultant companies and producers with reliable information that are accurate for the specific markets that they are thinking of. And I think that's a very important topic, because finally what we see in our markets is there is a lot of market pressure from the demand side to go into CO2 friendly schemes. There are consumers that are wishing CO2 friendly products. There are retailers that are defining that in a certain sector or even in general they want to bring down their CO2 footprint, and this is going through the value chain into developing countries too. And it's a private sector mechanism. It's not an issue of government regulation. I think it's something coming from the markets, and we simply try to support on the methodological side, as here, giving the reliable instruments to work on this topic. But we also work on the capacity building and SME promotion and investment promotion with our partner countries in order to make the private sector there fit to be really state of the art and be or keep included in these supply chains. So that was my presentation. If you need more information, we have also a homepage, or maybe in the coffee break I can tell you if you are interested in a very specific country. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. As introduced, my name is Paul Warakira. I work with the Bureau of Standards in Uganda. First of all, I'll take this opportunity to thank the Swedish Standards Institute for having organized this session. And also in the same vein, I take this opportunity to thank the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs for having sponsored my participation. I'm here to share with you our initiatives on carbon footprint. If you look at the paper format, I'm going to present a background, the impacts of climate change in East Africa. Of course, this has been partly covered by the previous speakers. The emerging standards on product carbon footprint, then our experience with working with the ISO work on carbon footprint, and from a regional perspective, how do we, what's our thinking about how standards can contribute to sustainable development and also contributing to trade opportunities for the East African region. Of course, we cannot talk about carbon footprint without talking about climate change, which has been, it's the key topic within here, trade and climate change. If you look at the scenarios, projections for the African region, you realize that it is projected that by 2050, there will be an increase of 1.6 degrees in terms of temperature rise. This has been partly covered by the previous speakers. And also, if you look at Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, it's expected it will be 1.4 degrees warmer than the current situation. Of course, these are projections, but we cannot shy away from realizing that this might happen. If you look at the rainfall pattern, it's expected that this is going to increase over the continent, of course, with an exception of Southern Africa and the Horn of Africa, where the reverse is going to happen, whereby we shall have a decline of about 10% by 2050. So if you look at that, if that happens, it will be disastrous. So we need something must be done at the moment. Temperature increases are likely to lead to open water and soil evaporation. Now, looking at the impacts of climate change in East Africa, of course, what has been presented before it was Africa. And if you talk of Africa, of course, East Africa is part of Africa. What's happening at the moment is that there is induced gradual melting of ice caps on mountains of Kilimanjaro, Mount Kenya, and Mount Rwenzori. There's a lot of changes in biodiversity on these mountains. For example, some of the species are becoming extinct due to climate change. Serious impacts have been also experienced in the fisheries area, human health, food security, energy, and infrastructure. I think you can see that from that picture, you can see these are floods within eastern Uganda. The bridge is flooded and making the road impassable. That borehole is no longer functional. The water has been drained due to climate change. So these are some of the impacts that are going on over there. Now, I talked about melting of ice caps on Mount Kilimanjaro. If you look at the amount which was there by the year 1912, as opposed to what existed by 2002, you can see that there's a very big difference. We're having almost traces at that time. Now, as I speak now, you and I may not know how much of ice is remaining at that point. So you can see where we're heading to. I don't know what's going to happen after the next 10 years to come. Now, having talked about the impacts of climate change, of course, there are a number of measures which are coming up as a means of mitigating climate change, and one of which is the product carbon footprinting. But of course, as much as these are interventions for mitigating climate change, we do expect that there will be good indicators of communicating or assessing the life cycle assessment of a product in terms of how much carbon has been emitted throughout the life cycle of a product. It can also be used as a benchmark or as a basis for businesses to communicate to the consumers how environmentally friendly their products are. It's also expected that businesses will be able to reduce emissions throughout the supply chain of their products. As a result of this, there are emerging standards and schemes on carbon footprint. And of course, these instruments, as much as they will be used for supply chain management. Of course, many of them are springing up. For example, we have ISO 14485, 067, which is under development by ISO on carbon footprint of products, PAS 2050, which is already functional, and also the revised or supplementary requirements focusing on agricultural products, which is under PAS 2050, Part 1, and many others, GHG protocol. Unfortunately, as developing countries, we have not been given an opportunity to participate in most of these schemes. And therefore, that brings a lot of fear that these schemes or standards may affect the competitiveness and also participation of developing countries' international standards, in international trade or markets. Save for the ISO standard, because we have been able to participate in the development of this standard and have caused some bit of influence within our favor. Of course, if you have not been at the table, if you have not been able to participate in the process, it becomes very difficult for you to implement what is in there. The other aspect is that when you look at the nature of the international market, is that it requires highly competitive products. And if you are to be able to compete, you must put into consideration issues of quality products. And of course, now quality is fused with environmental sustainability. Now, we also look at how these markets are segmented between the rich and the poor. We would like to have our products move to the niche market. So this will require us being part of the process and be able to participate effectively. The other aspect is that the market does not matter who the producer is. As long as you can meet the requirements, as long as the market demands that we need high quality products which are environmentally sustainable, it will not look into where does it come from. Does it come from a developing country? Does it come from a developed world? Now, what is our experience on working with ISO work on carbon footprint? Of course, the concept of carbon footprint or the work on carbon footprint has been done elsewhere for over a decade. Unfortunately, for developing countries, this concept is new. And of course, it was recently introduced in 2010, and that was through the initiative of the Swedish Standards Institute with the sponsorship of SIDA. This gave us an opportunity as the East African community or partner states to participate in the development of the international standard on carbon footprint. As a follow-up on that, a regional project, a pilot project was instituted within the region, basically focusing on the development of this standard with a view of influencing this standard. And of course, one of the intentions of this project was to ensure that the developing countries' needs and priorities are taken care of or not compromised within the process of developing this standard. Of course, this could be after probably SIDA and SIS having identified that this international standard may present a trade barrier to developing countries, most especially if they're not involved in the process. Of course, we've been having a number of workshops within the region, and these have been arranged before the ISO meetings. During these workshops, we do identify the cross-cutting issues within the region, what are likely to affect us as a region, and be able to comfort them collectively. Pre-seminars have also been held, these before the ISO meetings, where we meet of course, experts who are working with this, who are fully involved in this process, with a view of assisting us, giving us technical advice on how to argue for our comments. We have been participating in ISO meetings, and of course, I'm happy to note that within this process, we have been able to learn a lot and be able to somehow influence this standard in our favor. And from that, we believe that, of course, even when it comes into effect, we shall be in a better position to work with it than the other schemes where we have not been able to, or whether we have never had an input. What has been created so far, or what achievements have been got with our participation? Some of them I've already talked about them. Awareness and novel knowledge has been created within the region. Of course, as I indicated from the start, that it's a new concept within our region, though it has been done elsewhere. But at least with the coming of this project and with the involvement of SIS and CEDA within the region, at least when we talk about carbon footprint, there's some bit of awareness, though a lot more needs to be done. We have also created regional networks, and that's why I think I'm here. Otherwise, if I've not been part of the process, I wouldn't have an opportunity to come and speak before you. Now, we are using these regional networks for sharing information. I cannot know what's going on, say, in New Zealand, as far as carbon footprint is concerned. We have also somehow influenced the development of this standard. If you look at, we had issues as a region, especially to do with emissions as a result of air transport. When you talk of land use change is actually, it's what's going on, because we are starting to develop, and therefore we have to use our resources to develop. So when there are some clauses under land use change which were really affecting us, where we feel that we cannot be able to be competitive. Fortunately, some of these have been addressed, and this is as a result of our participation in this process. Now, what are we doing at the moment after having been part of the process? Because we are aware that this standard most likely will be out next year. And of course, as a region, since we are highly vulnerable to impacts of climate change, we would like to associate ourselves with any global initiatives geared at addressing climate change. Now, because we need to prepare ourselves and our society, we did organize a regional workshop on carbon footprint, and this was hosted by Makerere University, which is the leading university in East Africa. This training was held in June this year. Of course, Makerere University worked with the Bureau of Standards, where I work from, and also with its partner universities, University of Dar es Salaam and University of Tanzania, rather University of Dar es Salaam and Nairobi University. They were part of the process. Now, this training attracted over 45 participants within the East African region, from the academia, industry, civil society organization, government, amongst others. And the facilitators did come from the academia, because within our regional MIRA committees, we have members from the university and also from the industry. Of course, this was the first of its kind, and it was a way of exposing people to new techniques on how to estimate soil carbon stock above the ground in biomass, issues related to understanding sources and pathways of carbon sinks were discussed, And we do intend to make this an annual event within the region, rotation. It started in Uganda, hosted by Makerere University. And next year, we intend to have it around the same time, probably in Tanzania, hosted by Dar es Salaam University or Nairobi. Why do we work with academia? Because since we are creating awareness and building some of capacity, we need to work with academia. The issue of carbon footprint seems to be complex, and therefore you need to work with an informed mind. If you are to create awareness, you have to start with an informed mind, such that you also get to know what you intend to package. You need to package this before you go to the other categories. The training was done through different modes. This was through lecture presentations, participants' presentations, group work, practicals, and also a field excursion. Of course, this is one of the areas which was visited. CDM Center in Jinja. The Jinja is in western Uganda. If you have been to Uganda. Source of the Nile. Now, under this CDM Center, this is a municipal arrangement. It's on solid waste management. There are 9, this is a point of activities under the CDM concept. So there are 9 municipal centers in Uganda which are running this scheme jointly. And we are able to visit the Jinja Municipal. And it's the first of its kind in Africa under the CDM, point of activities. Then the other side, of course, we're also able to measure or estimate carbon stocks in tree trunks. And this is part of Mabira Forest. I don't know if you have been to, it's the biggest forest in Uganda, Mabira Forest. Though it's under threat of being converted into cropland, growing sugarcane. There's a lot of debate going on over there. Now, I've talked about our training and what have you. Of course, we are sharing information with the regional networks that have been created. Because since this is a new concept, we need to be alert. We need to be informed of what's going on periodically. So we use the regional network that we have formed through our participation in international standardization work. We are creating awareness and ownership among different actors. Creating awareness is a process which cannot be done overnight. And you have to come up with strategy. What strategy are we using now if we are to create awareness? Because at the moment, this is the concept of carbon footprint is amongst the agencies which are the elites, if I may say so. But we need to, if you are to create awareness, you have to come up with other strategies on how we can be able to reach out to a wide scope. And one of which is that we are conducting trainings of various actors, industry, academia, civil society organizations. The other aspect is that we want to work, we are piloting in university and tertiary institutions. We are creating students' clubs on carbon footprint and on environmental conservation. Because if you are to create awareness, then you have to look for other means of. If you work with the universities, creating school clubs, then we're also piloting at the secondary school, and here we are looking at essay writing competition on environmental management, on environmental issues. Then the other aspect, at the primary level, we are piloting quiz. This is the strategy that we're using at the moment. And it seems to be working, so we just need to widen the scope and then take it to other areas. Why are we working with the carbon footprint? Why are we putting a lot of efforts in doing this? Of course, it has been mentioned by the previous speakers, and I'm just reiterate that we are highly vulnerable to negative impacts of climate change as a region, and therefore any initiatives geared at combating climate change, we would like to associate with such initiatives because of our vulnerability and low resilience to climate change. The other aspect is that if you look at our export matrix, our products are environmentally sensitive. They're basically agricultural produce, as been mentioned by the previous speakers. And their resilience to climate change is very low. The other aspect is that we are distant from the international markets, where we normally send our products, and that's the niche market which we are targeting. This limits us to one mode of transport, that's air, because our products are perishable. And at the moment, we are not doing value addition due to some logistical challenges. The other aspect is that I talked about competitiveness of the international market, the global market. So if we are to be competitive within the global market, we must ensure that our products meet the requirements of the global market. If it means low carbon footprint, we need to do a lot of work within the area, within our scope. For example, we are not responsible for air transport, so we cannot change much. But we can be able to improve as much as we are aware that we are a low-intensity economy, but we can still do more to reduce our emissions and be able to make our products very competitive in the international market. How could standards, especially international standards, bring sustainability, environmental sustainability, and trade opportunities for the ES region? This is from a regional perspective. Of course, from the partner states, the 5 countries that make up East Africa, there's a lot of push to have value addition within the region. And this will require high technology if you are to reduce on our carbon footprint. Because at the moment, we know value addition. But if we are to go into this, the standards will contribute in such a way that we shall adopt high technology. The other aspect is that is the cost, the low cost of production. At the moment, as I talked about various schemes on carbon footprint. So it will be much easier for us to send our products to different markets with the same requirements. That's if we have an harmonized rule, and in this case, the international standard, than dealing with the segmented markets with different requirements. The cost of production becomes very high. So we would push for having an international standard in this respect. And this will also lead to understanding the market requirements. How do you look for information? You need to collect information and manage it. The other aspect is productivity. If you look at productivity within our area at the moment, within the region, especially for agriculture products, it's still low. You need big chunk of land to produce a lot of a given product. So we are clearing our forests, we are clearing the natural resources because we want more land, and land is an issue within our region. But we can still improve on our varieties. We can use improved varieties, you can use a small piece of land and be able to get the same yield instead of clearing the forest. Now, with the coming of these standards, especially carbon footprint, it is going to guide, it's going to bring sanity within the production process, and therefore we shall be looking at how do we improve our productivity. The other aspect is changing culture. The culture over there is that if I'm to buy a product, I look at its functional. Is it functional? I don't look at the other aspect of how friendly environmentally it is. I look at the cost. The issue of cost, price influences our buying than the other aspect. And I think with the coming of the standards and awareness that we're trying to create, this is going to be the reverse. The other aspect is that standardization in the region is perceived as a government issue. It's government work. It's government, and therefore the stakeholders have nothing to do, the private sector have nothing to do with the standards. They look at it as government using it, especially the national standards. But then with the coming of international standards and also competitiveness at the market level, this is going to change our culture, the thinking that standards are used globally, not only nationally. Now, we have also come up with other initiatives, of course, as a means of trying to protect our environment, or carbon footprint reduction, now at the household level. What are we doing as a region? We are adopting the use of solar energy use, but of course there's no adaptation to this, because if you look at the cost of a solar panel vis-a-vis the poverty levels, there are very few households which can be able to afford this. Charcoal burning kilns, still low adoption because of being immobile. Of course, the practice is I would prefer having either a mobile charcoal stove. People go to the gardens, and of course they want to, from morning to evening, they may decide to prepare meals from over there, which you can't do with the burning, the kiln. The charcoal stoves, these are working well, and many families are going for them. Then there's also tree planting, which is being done within the region. For example, in Western Uganda, we have a project codenamed Plan Vivo, which is extensively planting trees within the region. Some work is also going on within Kenya, the Kitui area. Those of you who have been to Kenya, there's a lot of tree planting going on. Biogas, this still has a low adoption because of the cost of the digester, and also few families can afford to have more than 2 animals to be able to use biogas. The other aspect is that we are the civil society organizations. They are working, they are lobbying the government to ensure that government enacts laws which are able to safeguard the environment. Of course, and also including implementation, especially at the local level. Because as a region, we have very good policies on environment, but the challenge is implementation, especially when it comes to the local level. There are issues over there. Okay. Challenges, I talked about awareness. This still, as much as we are doing a lot, but it's still low. Then we have limited financial and human capacities. If you are to do carbon footprint studies or carbon footprint, you need finances. Regional data, we don't have data. Now our national data, most of the data that is being used is foreign data. And of course, sometimes issues of credibility come into play. We want to come up with our own data. Then the other thing is that there's also perception that this standard is a trade barrier within the region. So there are some people who don't want even to hear about it. No carbon footprint, it's a trade barrier. What are our future plans? We intend to continue working with the established regional networks in sharing information, create awareness up to the grassroots level, and also having trainings for different policy and operational levels as means of. We intend to build capacity in the areas of undertaking life cycle studies and also PCR development. Through the academia, we intend to bridge the research gaps that do exist within the region, especially on data management and data collection. And one of our vision is to develop a regional PCR and a database as a means of being part of the process. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone, and yeah, I'd also like to thank SIS and SICA for making it possible. I won't spend very long on introduction and also try to go through my presentation quite quickly, but there is a lunch break afterwards, so if you then have discussions or questions, feel free to come and find me in the break. I'm going to talk about, give you a little bit of an overview on why carbon footprinting, and we'll do that very quickly. We'll give you a bit of an overview of what are the different standards, because there are so many around at the moment, so I'm trying to shed some light on that, and talk you through some examples on how carbon footprinting has been done and what initiatives are going on in New Zealand. So there is a wide range of organizations and labels, and they all provide guidelines or standards on how to do carbon footprinting. To someone who's not dealing with it every day, it looks a bit like this. So instead of getting directions, you don't really know where to go. So what I'm trying to do is to bring that in a bit of an order for you. So we've got standards, guidelines, protocols, specifications. We've got them on an international level, we've got national ones, and we have them developed by governments, NGOs, by industry groups, or even on an international level by lots of countries together. So what are the I'll come to those. And what do they all try to do? They all try to look at the whole life cycle and look at the carbon emissions from raw materials through to production, construction, operation, waste, back to recycling. And it actually all informs planning stage already. Food miles have been mentioned quite a bit this morning, and they're actually in between here everywhere. But it's not just about the transport, as we'll see in some of the examples a bit later. It's actually about all those stages of the life cycle that we need to be concerned about. An example is given by Unilever, who have done lots of LCA work, and this is actually available on their website. If you look at a cup of tea, cold tea, iced tea, 3/4 of the carbon footprint is in the raw materials. If you look at a hot cup of tea, the raw materials are just 1/4. And it's all in heating up the water. Now, if you look at ice cream, it's actually in distribution. So it depends very much what product you're looking at and what life cycle stage is most important. And that is why we need to look at the whole life cycle of the products, and not just at food miles or just at the raw materials. Now, there are other companies out there doing that as well. Levi's, for example, have done this study here on whoops, I'm going to go that fast, on carbon footprinting, but they also have done a lot of work on water footprinting. And it probably is obvious to everyone where is the key impact in a pair of jeans. Any ideas? In the use phase. It's all the washing. So it's not even in the production. Now, what is carbon footprinting used for? Internal benchmarking, development of new products, also consumer awareness. I've seen labels from Marks and Spencer's who put in their clothes that you should wash at colder temperatures because the main impact is in the use phase. It's policy development, marketing, of course, it feeds into eco-labels, a whole range of reasons on why carbon footprinting is done. And now I come to all those different standards. They're actually all based on the life cycle assessment standards, ISO 14040 and 44. And then we've got industry-specific guidelines, the greenhouse gas protocol, We've got a carbon footprinting standard coming up. It'll be a draft international standard that will be circulated end of December. The PAS 2050, a revised version just came out recently. Something on environmental product declarations. And I've put that one in here, although it doesn't deal with carbon, but water I think is quite important too. And it's also based on life cycle assessment. And then there are additional specifications. If you want to do this for specific products, you get even more guidance. Now, what is the difference between all of those? They all go back to 40 and 40, which was already done in 1966, so quite a while ago. So there is some experience behind all of those standards. The PAS 2050, I think Graham Sinden, I don't know if he's here yet, but he'll be here this afternoon, and he was one of the main authors, so if you have any specific questions to the PAS, just wait until this afternoon and ask Graham. It refers to the LCA standards. There is a greenhouse gas protocol from the World Resource Institute, refers to 14040. The carbon footprinting one that I've talked about. And if you have any specific question on this, the convener of the working group, Klaus Radunsky, is in the audience, so good to see you here. This is an example for environmental product declarations based on LCA. So they're not, well, they're called an eco-label type 3, but they're a lot more than just an eco-label and explain the whole life cycle assessment data and additional information. I mentioned that there are examples for industry-specific ones. So the International Dairy Federation, for example, agreed on an international guideline on how to do carbon footprinting for dairy products. And again, it's based on the LCA standards. So that all of those standards don't contradict each other. They're actually all rather similar, but some of them just give further guidance on how to do the carbon footprinting for specific products. And one of the key differences is who put them together. Like if you want something that is internationally agreed and where everyone can have an input into, that would be then the ISO standards. And in terms of choosing which one to use, it really depends on what do you want to do with it. Do you want to use it internally? Do you just want to get started with it? Sort of to get to know carbon footprinting? As with everything, it's horses for courses. So you can look at any one of those and get some guidance on getting familiar with carbon footprinting. Now, if you actually want to work with it, you'll have to stick to something that is agreed upon by a larger audience or internationally. So if you want to work with it, you'll have to stick to one of the guidelines that I've mentioned. If you actually want to use it in competition, say international trade, it's probably wise to use an internationally agreed standard as soon as we have one for carbon footprinting. In the meantime, the PAS 2050 is used very widely. So as I said, they're all different in a way on who put them together, what is the intention behind them. If you come to using them, you need to work out what do you want to use it for. So just a couple of examples from New Zealand on, it's a country far away from all our export markets. Most of our economy is based on agricultural products being exported. So quite similar in a way to a lot of countries in Africa. It's export of food products, primary sector products. Now our Ministry for Agriculture and Forestry have put a greenhouse gas strategy together in 2009, I think it was 2008, 2009 it started then. And they have co-funded pilot studies for a whole range of different sectors, and just some of them. So forestry, apples, lamb, venison, dairy products, berry fruit, onions, kiwi fruit, wine. I think we did some on avocados as well, on summer fruit, on wool, So a whole range of them. And they were all only co-funded by the ministry, and industry had to also come in. And also they were all based on real industry data. And if you're interested in finding out more, I can just see me afterwards and I can send you the link, because some of those studies are actually just case studies, but some of them are guidelines and helping industry to apply for, well, they're all based on the PAS 2050 because there wasn't an ISO standard on carbon footprinting around. So they're good examples and some guidelines that can be used elsewhere as well. So I'll start with the forestry one, and I was actually involved in that one. For forestry sector, we did a methodology report, and we did a report on the average greenhouse gas emissions of forestry products, on logs actually only. We didn't do the products, but we did do guidelines for 4 different types of forest products: for pulp and paper, sawn timber, engineered wood products, there would be a particle board and those sort of things, and also for logs. I won't go too much into the detail here. We did include just what we did include: transport, forest roading, but we excluded capital goods and soil carbon. Soil carbon, there's still so much work to be done in order to work out exactly how much it is, so we haven't included that. It gives you an overview on our system. So we went through from nursery to harvesting and export. Well, transport to sawmill, and then we also did export. Lots of data collection, and we also used some external databases for that. We looked at different scenarios. Ground-based manual, that's your typical just 2 people with a chainsaw. Went to processor and highly mechanized forestry systems as well. So we did different examples. This is an example of how an input table looks like of the data that we've collected. And now finally some results. So 50% of it is actually in the harvesting. Not a lot is in the nursery, land preparation, establishment. It really is all in the harvesting and then in the transport. That is just harvesting in more detail. And this is where it becomes really interesting. If we look at export, that is a transport. So what does it tell us? That if we export the logs, we have a whole lot of extra carbon. But if you know a little bit about forestry, only about 60% of the actual log will end up being in sawn timber. So we're exporting 40% that will be turned in renewable energy probably. But does it really make sense? I mean, we could do the value-added product and do the processing in the country, and then we'd have 2 advantages. One is we don't cut all that extra product around that we don't need to cut around, and we also have the value added in our country. And that is probably very similar to what countries in Africa could do with their produce that they export. So that's an idea, and it becomes very clear when you look at the whole carbon footprint. And then we developed those guidelines so that companies in the forestry sector could do their own studies. And I'll go even quicker through this one to leave some time for our last speaker. This was on lamb. And the idea was also to develop a benchmark on lamb. And the functional unit was 100 grams of portion in the UK, because that is where we export a lot of lamb to. And food miles are thrown at us all the time. So everyone goes, oh, food miles, don't buy lamb from New Zealand. So we thought, well, better do a proper benchmark. And yeah, we didn't take carbon sequestration on the farms into account, although there are some shelter belts grown and all those sorts of things. But we thought, no, we'll just focus on the actual growing the meat and the sheep. And if you look at this, 80% is actually on farm and only 5% is in transport. And if we look at on farm in more detail, 3/4 of the on farm emissions are actually from the methane emissions from the sheep directly. So there's not so much we can do about reducing the carbon footprint of lamb. There is research going on, but what was really interesting is that the transport isn't all that dominant. So to conclude, there are all sorts of different standards, and they will come back to the basic principles of life cycle assessment. And as the different examples and also the one from Unilever at the beginning have shown, it's important to look at that whole life cycle and not focus in on the food miles. And it's not only what type of standard or guidelines you use. The main difference in the results will be in what data you use, what are the assumptions, what external review has been done. Wrong direction. So applying carbon footprinting it's really more to provide a level playing field for the quantification of the greenhouse gas emissions. It's to support correct and comparable communication of carbon footprints, and that communication can be within the supply chain, but also to consumers. Within the supply chain is quite important, because if you produce a raw material, or if you produce produce that gets processed by someone else, the consumer will still want to know, would want to know what is the carbon footprint. And the processors themselves won't be able to do it if they don't know what happens in the production phase or in the growing phase. So it really, there is that business-to-business element of communication. And those standards just help to enhance the credibility and transparency of the quantification. It also helps those companies internally to develop their carbon strategies, because only once you know in what part of that life cycle you have your highest carbon impact, you can start putting your strategies into place to reduce them. It also very often helps to start a new type of dialogue within the supply chain, because most dialogue in supply chains, from produce to processor to consumer, is cost. That's what they're mostly interested in. But now that there is a lot more focus on the carbon, that gives companies and even producers and suppliers an extra dimension to that communication. And I've seen examples where it really changed and helped to get messages across, that the emphasis went away a little bit, at least, from just cost to other impacts. Well, I hope I've tidied that up a little bit for you. And if you have further questions, then either we might have a little bit of time at the end for questions, and otherwise happy to see you in the break. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana, and good morning, everyone. Indeed, the OECD Joint Working Party on Trade and Environment has looked at carbon footprinting, and we have a publication. It's coming out hopefully in January. I didn't make it for COP17, but I was tasked with trying to raise some of the issues, so we had a really set of very thorough presentations. I'll try and then really go quickly, if not skip over these first two, to really run to the third one. So we've seen that, for example, at the Carbon Trust, we have, and many other labels, the idea of finding a CO2 equivalent per unit. A lot of people forget that greenhouse gases are a lot more than carbon. Barbara's just mentioned methane from sheep is just one example. It doesn't have to be on the package. It can be on the store shelf, on the website. And here is a famous example of the kiwi fruit. Again, a bit like Barbara just explained, it was not in the transport, the food miles aspect, but really in the storage, cold storage, and so on. So I think that the first set of issues has been touched on already, but I'd really like to emphasize is why carbon footprinting. And we've identified 6. One is perhaps the most important for the company is is not marketing per se, but actually internal management. And as the ISO standard is sort of, in that sense, the same philosophy as 9,000 and 14,000. We're really talking about management, identifying the hot spots to reduce greenhouse gases. And then, of course, you can compare products similar. We heard about asparagus from Peru. Here's an example, broccoli from Ecuador that indeed turned out to have a lower carbon footprint than from Southern Europe. You can decide whether you want to buy your orange juice in cans, in bottles, and so on by looking at the footprint. Something which is perhaps more controversial is when a label claims that it's carbon neutral. Of course, there is no such thing per se in a product, but it's because offsets have somehow been included, so the whole issue arises of whether that information should not be presented separately, for example. One of the French supermarket chains is printing out carbon on the ticket at the checkout counter. And then I think one of the most important points is that business, and particularly large businesses today, make that point at the end, and that it's not just cost, as Barbara said, with its engagement. And it's not necessarily the image and market niche or differentiation, but there's a layer in between, which is risk management. It's extremely important today for investors, the institutional investors, to demonstrate that they're. So this is another version of Barbara's forest that we have whatever consumer confusion or certainly a plethora of schemes. She's done, I think, a very good job of trying to put some order in that. So now, to go issue by issue, she's also touched on harmonization. It's certainly been a bumpy ride in the case cooperation sometimes between some of these, but it seems that things are now on a good path. We just heard that 14067 is due out very soon. GHG protocol, particularly the product one, is now fairly well established, and past 2050, as we've heard, has already been reviewed and revised with the supplemental requirements. European Union is actively investigating also the possibilities of integrating some of these into perhaps their eco level, although that's still very much up in the air. Boundary setting, one of the big issues, what do you include, what do you exclude? We heard from Barbara too that at least one case, capital goods was excluded. Where do you draw the line on transport of employees? One point that's been made in terms of discrimination is that in developing countries, employees would tend to use public transport, and is that something that should be favored? How far to go beyond production? In some cases, the boundaries have excluded use and disposal, even though overall, of course, it's the life cycle assessment approach. And carbon offsets, as I've mentioned earlier, I think the general wisdom is that it should not be included to give a full picture, but it should be, if if the information is important for the company or the product, it should be stated separately. Data, huge issues. Most of it that's available is applicable to industrialized countries. One recommendation is that it should be clearly stated in any carbon footprint exactly what kind of effort was put into collecting the data, so that one really knows whether these are default values. This is one of the problems then. There are these databases. They're growing. The data is getting better, but when in doubt, use the default value. Well, the whole point of carbon footprinting is precisely to reflect the local conditions, so that's not really fair, is it? But that's what's, when in doubt, when there's nothing else, we fall back on what's there. Soil carbon, again, we've heard a couple mentions about difficulty measuring it, but it is an important, both positive for agriculture as both a contribution to climate change situation, as well as can be a serious contributor to emissions. Land use change, Paul mentioned this, is important. Here's a study by the World Bank on plantations in East Africa, and as you see, most of the values are pretty similar. What is just clear off the chart is the penultimate bar graph, where the worst case scenario on land use change would really completely disqualify the one farm in terms of the competitiveness on the basis of carbon footprinting. So it's recognized an important issue. How to deal with it in the methodology is still subject to different approaches. How do you communicate the message? If we're told there are 850 grams of carbon in this product, does that mean anything to you as a consumer, as a buyer? Probably not. So what we need is some sort of context. Some labels are just saying, this is good, here's our label. Others, for some of the energy efficiency products, for example, you see that it can go from A to G, and your washing machine that you're about to purchase is a B. Or you can probably more scientifically direct or honest is to indicate a range. Government involvement is a growing issue, probably because its intersection with trade law and trade issues. Most of these schemes started as private NGO or private sector initiatives, and we've seen a growing tendency for governments to become involved, either directly or indirectly. We've heard about some of the New Zealand, without pointing fingers, but some of the New Zealand support directly through the ministry. They've had a chair created at one of the universities, which is doing fantastic work, this kind of research and analysis on life cycle assessments. But then we have even more direct approaches, France, Japan, where the labels are actually, the products are actually assessed and worked out with multi-stakeholder working groups. And in the case of France, this final decision has still not been taken, but there's been every indication that there would be, that the labeling would be at some point mandatory. Now they're going beyond carbon. There's a whole series of environmental indications, as they call it. But this would definitely raise serious issues in the context of WTO trade law, as well as, of course, the European Union. The EU and others we've heard about this morning as well have supported and financed creation of data systems, which are so important in actually carrying out the assessment. This is one of the final points that I'd really like to stress. We have seen that more or less we're getting together on creating the standards, but as was pointed out by Stefan, presumably the consumer wants to believe in this and therefore wants third-party verification. There's been much less work and focus on this, and we know from studies on organics previously a decade ago that this was one of the big issues at the level of trade, international trade. In our about 20 systems, labeling schemes, that labeling and other assessment schemes that we looked at for carbon, we found very few actually had independent verification, and 14 of them were carried out actually by the scheme operators themselves or their consultants. So there's not really this third party, this arm's length distance in order to verify what is being put down. All this work on methodology, on data, on harmonizing the approach, but then who's to say that this is actually correct? And a couple of them, I must say, including some of those out front, there was no transparency about who actually is to accredit those then that are doing the verification. So that's the third level of important issues. And all this creates cost, which is my next slide. This is very simplified, based on relatively few interviews, but LCAs are expensive as well as complex. Perhaps that hasn't been emphasized as much this morning. Complex, yes, we all agree, no doubt about that, but they're also expensive. Here's a range for some fairly simple agricultural products, $3,500 to $15,000. For complex products, up to $70,000. Obviously, as a company or a country or whatever the unit is gets involved, there's a scale of a learning curve, and so that the later ones are less expensive. And verification, again, the point I just mentioned and emphasized previously, in our experience, can cost between $1,000 to $6,000 US dollars on site. But of course, there are the benefits. I mean, that's why we're doing it, right? So, a company, a cooperative agricultural exporter can hope get the increase in sales through product differentiation. They're doing something right for the consumer. And of course, there's the identification of hotspots I mentioned in the beginning, energy savings, waste, and improving the image. But again, I would like to emphasize that for some of the the largest company in France at the conference board meeting recently said that they were really doing this for investors. Investors wanted to know, what are you doing in terms of not only climate change, but in terms of what you're looking at along the supply chain. Something that this panel hasn't really talked about is sort of the next phase, what we call scope 3, looking beyond the product itself to the whole supply chain involved. And that's where their emphasis and their reason and their explanation to shareholders putting all this effort and time and money is to reassure the investors. It's a risk management strategy. Barbara mentioned talking to the supply chain, engaging. But one study, very small sample, but I came up with a figure that product level GHG emissions were decreased by 15 to 20% after the analysis. The old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. Oops, wrong button. So just a few useful sites. France, New Zealand Commission, totally non-exhaustive, could go on for several pages. And this is the name of our publication that's out in 2000, hopefully within a couple months. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Now we have some time for questions and discussions. Yes, please.
Here we go.
I feel I don't think. Thank you very much. I feel very interesting presentations. I just want to comment on the costs of carbon footprinting. And I wonder why the OECD did not also interview corporates, which are really drivers in this whole use of implementation of carbon footprint. And what I learned from them is that it pays back. Of course you have to invest, but the return of investment is significant because of identification of how you can improve the efficiency along the supply chain. If you ask retailers like Walmart, for instance. My second point is to Paul Waller-Kira. I feel that's really a very nice presentation which shows how even very poor countries could benefit from the use of carbon footprint and how you could manage in order to address this challenge. And indeed it's a challenge in particular for small companies in the supply chain, and I feel probably more studies would be needed in order to get a broader picture how you can improve the efficiency for the benefit of trade and for the whole society. I feel that it's very useful because only a search on the whole footprint gives relevant information. Finally, I feel that's one very important point that one should not forget. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. Very good presentations. I'm trying to relate the, excuse me, the standards issues to some trade issues. Standards can facilitate trade. They can also inhibit trade. And in WTO disputes, I believe sometimes, standards arise as issues. And to what extent governments have been following international standards in the imposition of their own trade policies. And so my question is about all of these unverified standards, if I can call them that. I mean, if the credibility of maybe all of them, or nearly all of them, is at issue, can these standards play a constructive role in international trade disputes? There's the question.
I want to know these standards, how's the governments of these countries, how are they helping people who can't meet the standards? Or are they even helping people who can't meet the standards?
Hi there, thank you. I just would like also a little bit more clarification on the carbon footprinting issue. It's very interesting. Just two points, maybe you could touch on a little bit more in depth. The first relates to the life cycle analysis, and I'm just wondering to what extent the product's life cycle is actually a closed system where you can sort of deduce all the carbon footprint. I mean, take for example a heavily value-added product. Do you have to perform a life cycle not only on that product, but on all of the inputs that go into that product? Or where does it end? I mean, you mentioned, for instance, workers traveling to the factory or whatnot. What degree of consensus is there, for instance, on where to draw the line? And sort of a related issue, also on the relationship to trade, to what extent are such standards anti-developmental? I find your example of forestry actually interesting in the sense that it's almost pro-developmental in that a standard in a country which promoted the importing of finished forestry products would actually be to the detriment of any potential processing they would have in their country. It encourages New Zealand itself to develop the wood rather than importing the raw material and doing it themselves. So there seems to be some interesting issues. Then I'm just wondering what the kind of debates, the major talking points are in this relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we, the panel, try and answer the questions?
Okay, I can have a go at two of the questions. One is the one, how does countries help sort of in a country to understand and interpret and also, I guess, contribute to the development of those standards? Because, for example, with the 14067, every country that participates, and I think it's more than 50 countries participating in the development of that standard, there is a mirror committee in every country. And I mean, I can only say what happens in New Zealand, that we facilitate regular workshops where we talk to the stakeholders interested in it and explain what the progress is and highlight specific issues that might be relative for New Zealand. And after that, the participants go away and can make informed comments on the standard that will then be consolidated and discussed in the group and then go back to help and shape the standard. So I think workshops in countries, and what I hear from the ISO meetings is that most countries would do that they have workshops or mirror group meetings where they discuss the development of the standard and their contributions to that. Does that answer the question? Okay. And then the other one that I can make a comment on is on the system boundaries. So where do you draw the system boundaries? Where do you stop? And if I, for example, look at, I don't know, a bottle of water, I definitely have to look at the water as it is, I don't know, pumped out of the ground and all that. But I definitely also have to take into account the plastic material of the bottle and the cap. And if there is a label, I have to take that into account as well. So what is not taken into account usually, in the case of the bottle it wouldn't be, is the capital goods, as in the machinery that is used. So that usually is excluded. But the production of all those materials would have to be included. And if you, I don't know, take the example of the logs that are exported, you would take the diesel of the trucks, the refinery process, and actually getting the crude oil, the refinery process to the diesel, you would take all that into account as well. Because you can't do that in every single study over and over again, there are those databases. There is the ILCD one that Dale mentioned, and there is the EcoInvent one, and there are a number of other commercial databases available where you can find that information.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to, Dr. Klaus talked about improving efficiency across the system, which I think, of course, as a region, we are more than ready to ensure that we improve efficiency within our scope. Of course, in the areas where we feel we can influence. You realize that at the moment, as I said, our productivity is still low. Now, in terms of, if you look at the practice there, people are using handheld hoe, and if you look at the practice which is going on, even if these are small actions, but when you band them together, they can substantially contribute to GHG emissions. So we are working a lot to ensure that we minimize within our boundary. But of course, there are areas beyond our control. We cannot do much. Thank you very much.
I had at least one question directed at me, and then I might take a shot at the trade law question. I mean, the answer about why we didn't interview businesses that we did, in fact. I mean, there was one slide on costs, and the slide following immediately was on benefits. So I don't know if you wanted me to put the benefits slide first, but the point is, in addition to the complexity, they are expensive. Now, of course, $5,000 is nothing for a multinational corporation, but or an annual fee, but it is for a Ugandan cooperative, farmers cooperative. So, I mean, you know, it's all a matter of relativity. And of course, these are very, very vague numbers. But anyway, on the trade law, okay, there have been 3 disputes recently on labels in which they all didn't pass the tests, okay? Now, of course, once again, the WTO bent over backwards to say that they were in no way challenging the public policy objective behind these. But in the case of tuna dolphin 3, the way it was being presented, they found it to be trade restrictive. And in the origin for, I think it was meat between Canada and the US, similarly, it was found not to be implemented correctly. Now, I'm not here to pontificate about WTO law, but the point is, once again, that under the technical barriers to trade agreement, you have regulations and you have standards. Regulations are mandatory, standards are voluntary. We often use the word standards freely to mean anything that's kind of defining a process, and you're absolutely right, they can be either trade promotional or they can be trade restrictive. The whole point of trying to get an international view or approach, whether you call that harmonization or mutual recognition, is precisely to make sure that they're promoting trade and not restricting trade. But in the case of actually putting them into effect, the implementation was found in some of these recent decisions to be extremely important. So it's not, once again, as my point was, it's not just what the standard setters get together after years and come up with on paper, but it's the way then that they're actually implemented and whether they are discriminatory, whether you have relative access to verification, whether the accreditation is in place and so on. All of those will enter into the decision of the WTO trade judges. But there are fears that they can be discriminatory. I think there's enormous effort, including by the Swedes, to get all of the interested parties involved, and I applaud the initiative. I think it's an important step forward, but it's something which has to be an aspect to be taken care of at all stages. Thanks.
Yes, regarding the very first statement, I can only support. In our experience, it's exactly the case. Most of the work we do in the standards area, including in CO2 standards, we do not because of environmental objectives, but it's basically because of the economic incentive that the companies have. So we are not part of the Ministry of Environment. It's also a little bit the logic, but we see that the potential for improvements on the company level is tremendous, and that's what we try to seize these opportunities. Then there was one question, who would support the SMEs to achieve such standards and whether we do support SMEs. As I tried to point out, we are working rather through the intermediary level. So we do create structures in the countries, in our partner countries, that would help SMEs to do such exercises, which really can be usually costly. One case I showed was the Cleaner Production Center, that is assessment units that can do environmental assessment. Another example how we try to bring costs down, we have a program together with Sweden also for awareness raising workshops on ISO standards in developing countries, and also there is a roll-out program to much more involve in general developing countries in the standards world. I think there's a couple of initiatives. Of course, you could also ask the question whether the private sector itself does support SMEs in developing countries, for instance. And in fact, there are some initiatives. Just to mention two, I've been some weeks ago with a Swiss trading company active in cotton and coffee and cacao trade, and in fact, you would expect it's a purely commercial operation, but what they do, they have a kind of sustainability and management service linked to their trading operations because they want to have their clients closer with their company. So it's not just a deal by deal relation they are looking for, but they're looking for longer client relations, and as part of these they support also companies in developing countries. Another example is, I know that the big European retailers, and I think it's also now including US retailers, try to cooperate in avoiding the duplication of audits in their supply chains. I mean, it's a huge problem that all the retailers have to check more or less the same issues. Is there child labor? What's the environmental impact? What about CO2 footprints and so on? And it has been a very good initiative, first started on the social field. It was called Business Social Compliance Initiative, where all the retailers matched their information so they could exchange information and they didn't have to go 3-4 times through the same supplier. And I think they're now expanding this to the environmental space also. So in general, I think that's really, there is some also opportunities that is coming directly from the private sector which would help SMEs in developing countries. But of course it's true what have been pointed out by OECD. Finally, it's an issue of the costs depending on products, and what we see, what's happening in the market is really different institutions also from the label field are trying to harmonize their standards. So maybe this could also help to bring costs down in the medium term.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to take any further questions during lunchtime or later on today. Thank you so much.